Emma's heart slammed against her ribcage like a caged animal, each beat louder than the last. The cabin smelled of stale smoke and sweat, mingling with the faint coppery tang of fear that clung to her skin. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, rattling the thin wooden shutters and whistling through the cracks in the walls. Shadows twisted across the floorboards as the single lantern flickered, its small flame trembling like Emma's hands. She knew she was alone, yet the heavy presence of someone else pressed against the edges of her mind. Cold and suffocating, she had been cautious when she came to this remote cabin at the edge of the canyon. The sun had dipped below the jagged cliffs hours ago, leaving the sky bruised with streaks of violet and blood red. Emma had thought it was safe, a hidden haven away from the lawless men and wandering trouble that often prowled the vast prairies. But now, as she stepped into the dim light, she realized how naive that hope had been. The man's shadow fell across the floor like a dark stain, stretching unnaturally long under the flickering lantern light. Emma froze, every muscle taut. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat. She could hear the scrape of boots against the wooden planks, the faint creak of joints and floorboards, a slow, deliberate advance that made her stomach twist into knots. "Don't touch me there," she whispered, her voice trembling like the flame before her, barely audible even to herself. The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile and desperate, yet the man ignored them. His hands moved closer, slow and deliberate, tracing a path along the edge of her arm. Emma recoiled, the wooden floor scraping against her knees as she stumbled backward. Her fingers clawed at the rough walls, trying to find balance, trying to find something, anything, that could give her leverage. But the cabin, with its peeling paint and broken windows, offered little protection. It was as if the building itself had abandoned her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Her senses screamed. The sharp scent of the lantern mingled with the metallic tang of fear, making her stomach turn. She could feel the chill of the night seeping through the cracks, creeping across her skin like icy fingers, making her shiver uncontrollably. Her pulse pounded in her ears, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out all other sounds until she heard it, the low rasp of the man's voice, a whisper too close to be ignored. "You can't run," he said. The words were venomous, curling through her like smoke, filling every corner of the room with dread. Emma's gaze darted to the small window, moonlight slicing across the floor in narrow beams. Beyond it, the vast prairie stretched endlessly, a silent witness to the horror unfolding inside the cabin. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries echoing off the cliffs, blending with the whistle of the wind and the creak of the cabin. World outside seemed indifferent, vast, and uncaring, and that realization sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Instinct took over. She lunged for the door, her boots kicking up splinters as she stumbled through the narrow threshold. The cold night air hit her like a slap, stealing her breath, and dust from the dry prairie clung to her damp hair and clothes. She forced herself to keep running, her feet pounding against the hard-packed earth, the chill wind biting at her face. Every nerve in her body screamed danger, and every shadow threatened to swallow her whole. Behind her, the man's footsteps followed, steady and relentless. The rhythmic pounding against the wooden floor had transformed into the steady crunch of boots on gravel, a constant, oppressive reminder that she was not safe, not yet. Emma's mind raced, plotting a route, seeking refuge among the jagged cliffs and scrubby desert brush. The canyon loomed ahead, a dark promise of both danger and escape. She had no choice but to run, no choice but to trust that the night and the wild might offer her a chance at survival. And as she stumbled over a rock and barely kept her footing, Emma realized something chilling. Her life could change forever. In the next heartbeat, the shadows were closing in, the wind howled like a warning, and the man behind her was more than just a threat. He was a force that could shatter her world entirely. Emma didn't dare look back. She didn't dare falter. She only ran, one desperate step after another, toward the unknown that might either save her or end her. The moment his hands brushed against her trembling arms, Emma felt a shiver that wasn't just cold, it was something deeper, something that clawed at the edges of her soul. It was as if the air itself had thickened, a heavy, invisible fog pressing down on her chest. She stumbled backward, catching herself on the splintered doorframe, the coarse wood biting into her palms. Her heart thundered violently, each beat echoing in her ears like a war drum. The cabin felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls themselves had leaned in, watching her panic with cruel patience. The man's face was a shadow in the dim lantern. Light, features distorted by the flickering glow. There was a subtle smirk curling his lips, a silent celebration of his dominance. Emma's stomach churned, bile rising, and a cold dread settled in her chest, heavier than any fear she had known before. This violation was different. It was not just physical. Something ancient, something dark, seemed to pulse in the corners of the room, awakened by his touch. The sensation made her skin crawl as if invisible chains had fastened themselves to her spirit. She stumbled again, nearly toppling over the loose floorboards. The lantern wavered, throwing brief, chaotic streaks of light across the room. And for a moment, she thought she saw shapes moving in the shadows, silent observers of her terror. Emma's fingers clutched at her blouse, twisting the fabric in it. A futile attempt to steady herself, to regain some control. But control was a luxury she did not have. Her instinct screamed at her to flee, to escape the cabin, the man, the nightmare that had become her reality. Outside, the prairie lay vast and indifferent. The last traces of sunlight had vanished behind the jagged cliffs, leaving a sky bruised purple and darkened with early stars. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying with it the scent of sage, dry earth, and something metallic, her own fear, or perhaps the threat that had followed her indoors. Emma could hear the faint echo of wolves in the distance, their mournful cries underscoring her sense of isolation. She was utterly alone, and the weight of it pressed against her like the night itself. The man advanced, his footsteps slow but deliberate. Emma's mind raced, cataloging every detail she could remember, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that flickered across the walls. "No," she whispered, barely audible, though the word was useless. Her body wanted to recoil, to vanish, to become nothing, but the room felt alive in its hostility. Each breath she drew seemed thick with oppression, each heartbeat a drum of impending doom. She felt as though she were being measured, weighed, and found wanting not just by the man, but by some unseen force that had been awakened when his hands touched her. A strange heaviness pressed upon her spirit, and she stumbled toward the cabin's small window, peering out at the vast open prairie. Freedom seemed like a distant dream, a cruel joke. The jagged cliffs rose like silent sentinels in the moonlight, indifferent to her terror. Yet within that stark beauty, a flicker of resolve stirred. If she didn't run, she would be consumed not just by the man, but by the darkness he had unleashed. Her hand shook violently as she opened the door, the dry, cold night air biting at her skin. Every step she took across the prairie sent clouds of red dust into her lungs, stinging her eyes and throat, but she ignored it. She ran, boots pounding, the hard-packed earth, heart hammering, and yet the weight on her soul seemed to grow heavier with every step. She could feel the man's pursuit, relentless and cruel, and somewhere deep inside, a nameless terror whispered that this darkness was not fleeting. It had marked her, tied itself to her very essence, and she did not know how she would ever escape it. The night stretched on endlessly, filled with the sounds of her ragged breathing, the crunch of boots against earth, and the faint, eerie cries of wolves. Emma's chest burned from exertion, but she forced herself onward. Somewhere beyond the shadows, beyond the cliffs and the canyon, there had to be hope, an ally, a savior, someone who could end this nightmare. She did not yet know it, but that hope would arrive in a form she could never have imagined. A figure from the wild, fierce and untamed, carrying the power to break the darkness that had claimed her night. And so she ran, every instinct screaming that she could not stop, could not falter, could not surrender. Because the weight on her soul, the curse of what had been done, was only beginning to take hold. Emma's lungs burned with each ragged breath, the dry prairie air scraping her throat like sandpaper. Her boots kicked up clouds of red dust that stung her eyes and filled her nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of fear that clung to her. The wind whipped across the open land, tugging at her hair and clothes, and she stumbled over rocks and tufts of coarse desert grass. Behind her, the man's footsteps followed relentlessly, crunching against the earth, a grim rhythm that promised he would not be stopped. Her mind raced, plotting every desperate escape route she could imagine. The jagged cliffs of the canyon loomed ahead, their dark silhouettes sharp against the bruised night sky. Moonlight glinted off the uneven rocks, creating long shadows that danced and twisted with her frantic movement. Each step threatened to throw her off balance, but she forced herself onward, driven by the raw instinct to survive. Emma's heart pounded like a drum, echoing through the empty prairie, a frantic signal of life amidst the silence of the night. The vast openness of the land, once beautiful and wild, now felt like a trap. There was nowhere to hide, no dense woods to obscure her path, only the endless stretch of dusty plain and the looming cliffs. Her chest heaved with exhaustion, every muscle trembling from the effort. Yet she could not slow, could not falter. The man behind her was more than just a threat. He was a force, relentless and cruel, and Emma knew instinctively that he would not stop until she was caught. A hawk cried in the distance, its sharp call slicing through the night. Emma's eyes darted across the horizon, searching for any sign of refuge. She spotted a narrow crevice in the canyon walls, jagged rocks forming a natural tunnel. If she could reach it, she might find temporary shelter, a place to catch her breath and gather strength. But the terrain was treacherous. One misstep could send her tumbling into the darkness below. Still, the desperate spark of hope drove her forward, propelling her over loose rocks and through the prickly brush that scraped her arms and legs. The man's shadow grew larger with each step she took, a monstrous presence that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Emma felt a cold weight settle over her spirit, the lingering echo of what had happened in the cabin gnawing at her resolve. The fear was more than physical, it was a darkness that clung to her, whispering that she could not escape, that she would be claimed by it no matter how far she ran. Her legs screamed in protest, but adrenaline surged through her veins, forcing her onward, one frantic step at a time. The wind rose suddenly, sweeping across the canyon with a force that threatened to knock her off her feet. Red dust and grit stung her skin, burning her eyes and throat, but she pressed on, keeping her gaze fixed on the shadowy crevice ahead. The world around her felt surreal, almost dreamlike, with the cliffs looming like silent sentinels and the stars above blinking coldly in the sky. Every sound, the crunch of her boots on gravel, the man's pursuit, the distant howl of wolves blended into a chaotic symphony of fear and urgency. Finally, Emma reached the edge of the crevice. She slipped inside, the jagged rocks scraping against her clothes and skin, but it offered the first moment of shelter she had found since fleeing the cabin. Her chest heaved as she collapsed against the stone, trying to catch her breath. The man's footsteps paused at the canyon's edge, and she dared a glance out. His shadow lingered in the moonlight, frustration and rage radiating from him like heat from a fire. For a brief moment, she allowed herself a trembling sigh of relief, though she knew it was temporary. The night was far from over. The prairie still stretched endlessly around her, and the darkness of what had been done in the cabin still clung to her spirit. Somewhere out there, salvation awaited an ally she could not yet see, a force as wild and untamed as the land itself. But for now, she was alive, hidden, and determined to survive the night. Emma pressed herself further into the shadowed rocks, her heart still racing, her hands scraped and bloody. And for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a single thought. She would not give up. She would keep running, keep hiding, keep fighting, because somewhere beyond this canyon, beyond the cruel hand that had touched her, a savior might arrive. And until then, she would endure, one desperate, ragged breath at a time. Emma's legs burned and her lungs screamed for air as she stumbled into the narrow crevice, the jagged rocks cutting into her hands and legs. She pressed herself against the cold stone, trying to steady her breathing, listening intently. The man had paused at the canyon's edge, his shadow stretching like a predator in the pale moonlight. She dared not move, not even to wipe the blood and dust from her scraped face. Every nerve in her body was strung tight, coiled with fear, and her chest ached with the effort of shallow, desperate breaths. She thought she was alone, trapped, helpless. And then she saw it, a sudden fluid movement across the canyon floor, too swift and controlled to be the man. Emma's eyes widened as a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, yet impossibly silent. His skin gleamed faintly in the moonlight, muscles taut and powerful, rippling beneath bare, sun-kissed skin. Long black hair flowed over his broad shoulders, and intricate tribal jewelry glinted against his chest. There was a fire in his eyes, fierce and unyielding, that seemed to pierce the darkness itself. The man chasing her froze. His confidence faltered, a ripple of uncertainty passing through his posture. The Apache warrior advanced with deliberate calm, every movement precise, as if he had merged with the wind and earth around him. Emma pressed herself further into the shadows, barely daring to breathe, but the presence of this new figure filled her with a fragile thread of hope. There was something primal and undeniable about him, an authority that no ordinary human could resist. "You're safe now." The warrior's deep voice rumbled across the canyon, steady and commanding. It wasn't loud, yet it carried an unmistakable weight, resonating through the space around them. The man hesitated, uncertainty clouding his features for the first time. The warrior's gaze held him in place, sharp and unyielding like the edge of a blade. Emma's chest lifted slightly, relief mingling with awe as she realized the man who had tormented her was no longer in control. The warrior's stance was unthreatening to her, yet radiated undeniable strength. Every line of his body spoke of years of survival, of knowledge honed in the wild. His bare feet touched the dust lightly, almost as if he were part of the land itself, moving with the fluid grace of the wind over the prairie. The moonlight caught the curve of his muscles and the beads of sweat on his skin, painting him as both protector and force of nature. Emma's fear began to ebb, replaced by a cautious trust she had not felt in hours. The man finally made a move. But it was futile. With a single fluid gesture, the Apache stepped forward, placing himself between Emma and the threat. The man's advance faltered and he stumbled back, uncertainty gripping him like ice. Emma felt a strange sense of awe. As she watched the confrontation, this warrior did not shout, did not brandish a weapon with anger. He simply existed, a living force of protection and authority. And that presence was more than enough to command the situation. Emma pressed her back against the stone, the jagged surface biting into her arms, and let out a shaky breath. The warrior's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in that glance she understood. She was no longer alone. There was safety here, and it came in the form of this silent, fierce guardian who had appeared out of the night as if summoned by her desperation. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and earth, grounding her in the realization that help had arrived. The man finally turned, stumbling backward into the shadows of the canyon floor, the fear in his eyes mirrored by the uncertainty in his movements. The Apache warrior remained perfectly still, a silent sentinel, watching until the threat receded completely. Only then did he turn to Emma, his expression softening slightly, though the fire in his eyes never waned. She felt a lump rise in her throat, gratitude and disbelief mingling. "You are safe now," he repeated, slower this time, his voice carrying reassurance rather than command. Emma nodded, unable to speak, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself a fleeting moment of hope. The night was far from over. The prairie still stretched endlessly around them, but for now, she had found an ally, an untamed force of protection in the wild, and a chance at surviving what had almost destroyed her. Emma exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest, and finally allowed herself to believe that salvation had arrived in the form of the unexpected ally who had come out of the shadows of the Old West night. Emma sank to the ground, dust and grit clinging to her torn clothing, trembling as her chest heaved. Her hands pressed against the jagged rocks of the canyon crevice, scraping her palms, but she scarcely noticed the pain. All her focus was on the towering figure before her, the Apache warrior who had appeared like a force of nature, standing firm between her and the man who had haunted her steps for hours. His presence was commanding yet calm, radiating an authority that made the air itself seem to hum with tension. He turned his piercing gaze toward her, and Emma felt as if he could see not just her fear, but every fragile, terrified part of her soul. "You are under my protection," he said, his deep, steady voice reverberating through the canyon, settling around her like a shield. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of absolute certainty. For the first time in hours, Emma felt the tiny ember of hope flicker to life inside her chest. She nodded shakily, unable to speak, still trembling from adrenaline and the raw terror of the night. The man who had chased her loomed behind the warrior, frustration and fury written across his features. He took a hesitant step forward, then froze as the warrior's hand moved in a slow, deliberate gesture, palms down, grounded, unwavering. The movement seemed almost ceremonial, yet undeniably powerful. Emma could feel the tension radiating from the warrior like a tangible force, pushing the intruder backward without a single strike. It was as though the land itself had joined the warrior, lending him the authority of the prairie, the cliffs, and the whispering winds. Emma swallowed hard, awe mingling with her relief. The warrior's bare skin glistened faintly in the pale moonlight, muscles coiled and powerful, every movement precise and controlled. Tribal jewelry, beaded necklaces, leather armbands, and small silver charms glinted faintly, catching the moonlight and adding a sense of ritualized strength to his appearance. There was a fire in his eyes, both fierce and unwavering, and Emma instinctively understood that he was not merely human, he was a protector, a guardian molded by the wild, bound to the earth and its ways. "You cannot touch her," the warrior continued, his voice calm yet filled with undeniable authority. The man faltered, uncertainty flickering across his face. Emma felt her pulse slow slightly as the oppressive weight of fear began to lift. It was not complete, yet she knew the night was far from over, but for the first time she felt a sense of safety, fragile and fleeting, but real. The wind swept across the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. Emma inhaled sharply, the familiar tang of dust filling her nostrils, grounding her in reality. She realized that the warrior's presence was more than physical protection. It was an invisible shield that extended to her very spirit, keeping the darkness at bay. She dared to lift her gaze, meeting his eyes, and saw only assurance and resolve. No malice, no doubt, only a promise. She would not be harmed while he stood watch. The man behind them muttered something incoherent and tried to advance. But the warrior's eyes met his with the cold fire of a predator, unyielding. Slowly, the intruder took a step back, then another, until he retreated into the shadows of the canyon floor, swallowed by the night. Emma exhaled in a shaky sigh, pressing her hands to her chest as if to feel her own heartbeat. The danger was not entirely gone, but it had been mitigated, vanquished, at least for now, by the presence of this extraordinary guardian. The warrior turned to her fully, the moonlight illuminating his features, high cheekbones, strong jawline, and eyes that were both kind and fierce. "You are safe now," he repeated, this time with a gentler tone. Emma's lips trembled as she whispered a simple, breathless, "Thank you." Her voice was small, fragile, but it carried the weight of gratitude and relief. He merely nodded, a silent acknowledgment of the bond formed in this night of terror. The wind carried the faint cries of distant wolves, a reminder that the prairie was wild and untamed, yet Emma felt a flicker of hope. With the warrior at her side, she could face the night. With him guarding her, perhaps survival was no longer just a desperate hope, it was a tangible possibility. She pressed her back against the jagged rocks, exhausted but still alive, feeling a newfound ember of courage ignite within her. For the first time since the terror began, Emma dared to believe that help had arrived, that the darkness of the cabin and the relentless prairie night might finally yield to the fierce protection of this remarkable man. The first light of dawn had begun to tint the horizon with streaks of gold and crimson when Emma finally dared to lift her gaze. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, wild and untamed, but the oppressive weight of the night's terror had not yet fully lifted. She pressed herself closer to the jagged rocks of the canyon, boots scraping against the dust, as the shadowy figure of the man who had haunted her crouched at the edge of the clearing, eyes darting between her and the warrior. The Apache warrior's presence radiated power, a force as natural and unstoppable as the wind that swept across the cliffs. His bare chest gleamed with the faint sheen of morning dew and exertion, muscles taut and coiled like a panther ready to strike, long black hair cascaded over his broad shoulders, adorned with beads and silver charms that glinted in the early sunlight. Leather armbands hugged his arms, each movement precise, controlled, and purposeful. Every line of his body spoke of decades spent surviving the harshest terrain, of strength tempered by discipline, of a will forged to protect those who could not defend themselves. The man who had pursued Emma took a hesitant step forward, the faint clink of his spurred boots against the rocks echoing through the canyon. "You can't stop me," he hissed, the words trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. But the warrior did not flinch, did not respond verbally. His gaze alone pinned the man in place, like an invisible chain tethered to the unyielding power of the canyon itself. Emma's heart pounded so loudly she thought he could hear it, but she felt the warrior's calm strength wash over her, steadying her own trembling limbs. A low wind swept across the clearing, rustling the sparse scrub and carrying the scent of sage and earth. The Apache shifted slightly, coiling his body, every movement deliberate, radiating an energy that seemed to expand outward, enveloping Emma in invisible protection. The man's confidence faltered. His eyes darted, searching for weakness, for any sign that he could reclaim control. But the warrior remained unwavering, an unmovable sentinel, silent yet commanding. Emma felt a thrill of awe course through her fear. Then the confrontation erupted. The man lunged, desperate, teeth bared, hands outstretched. But the warrior was fast or fluid as the river running through the canyon below. In a single seamless motion, he intercepted the attack, moving with a grace and precision that seemed almost supernatural. Dust and grit swirled around them as muscles flexed. Leather creaked, and the sound of feet scuffing against rock filled the air. The man stumbled backward, arms flailing, his fear palpable as the warrior's presence pressed down upon him like the weight of the earth itself. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she watched. The warrior's movements were powerful, controlled, and devastatingly efficient, each step, each shift of weight calculated to neutralize without unnecessary harm. The man's aggression faltered, desperation written across his features. And then, finally, he yielded, retreating backward into the canyon shadows, swallowed by the morning mist and dust. The threat that had haunted Emma for hours relentless, cruel and terrifying, was gone, at least for now. The Apache warrior turned to Emma, his piercing gaze softening only slightly. "You are safe," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying the calm authority of one who had mastered both body and spirit. Emma pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid rise and fall of her heartbeat, and exhaled, a shuddering, almost inaudible sigh of relief. The wind whispered through the canyon, rustling the rocks and scrub, carrying with it the faint cries of distant wolves and the scent of the wild prairie. For the first time, Emma felt the night's terror loosen its grip on her spirit. The prairie, though vast and untamed, no longer felt threatening. It felt alive, protective, and strangely comforting under the watchful presence of her new ally. She rose shakily to her feet, dust falling from her clothing, and allowed her gaze to take in the full sweep of the canyon. The cliffs, once ominous, now framed the scene like silent guardians, watching over her, echoing the strength of the man who had saved her. She realized in that moment that she had survived not just by chance, but because of courage, timing, and the fierce intervention of someone who belonged to the land as much as it belonged to him. And as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the red dust, casting long, dramatic shadows across the canyon floor, Emma dared to believe that the worst of the night had passed. Freedom, fragile and golden, had arrived with the Apache warrior. The first rays of the sun stretched across the canyon floor, painting the rugged cliffs in a warm, golden hue that contrasted sharply with the terror of the night. Emma pressed herself against the jagged rock, chest heaving, dust and grit clinging to her torn clothing. The man who had haunted her for hours was gone, driven off by the formidable presence of the Apache warrior. For the first time, she felt the fragile stirrings of hope, mingled with exhaustion that weighed her body down like lead. The warrior stood nearby, shirtless and imposing, his long black hair catching the sunlight, glinting against the intricate tribal jewelry that adorned his chest and arms. Muscles flexed and relaxed as he shifted his weight, eyes scanning the canyon for any lingering threat. Every line of his body radiated vigilance, strength, and an almost supernatural calm. Emma could feel the security of his presence wrapping around her like a protective shield. For hours, fear had pressed against her chest like a stone. Now it seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of safety she had almost forgotten. "You're safe," he said again, his voice low, steady, and infused with authority. Emma nodded, unable to find words at first, her throat tight from the events of the night. Slowly, she exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time. The canyon, once ominous and confining, now seemed alive with protection, the cliffs standing like silent sentinels around them. The wind rustled the scrub, carrying the scent of sage, dry earth, and freedom, a combination that made Emma's chest tighten with gratitude. She finally took a cautious step forward, boots crunching against the red dust, and the warrior's piercing gaze followed her every movement. His stance remained relaxed yet alert, a perfect balance of watchfulness and reassurance. Emma dared to look around, taking in the vastness of the canyon, the sharp ridges catching the light, and the prairie stretching endlessly beyond. She realized that the land, though wild and untamed, now felt like a sanctuary. The fear that had gripped her for so long was not gone entirely, but it had been subdued, held at bay by this man who seemed to embody both the spirit of the land and the strength to protect it. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready." The warrior sighed, his voice softening slightly. Emma's lips trembled as she finally found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible, but the words carried all the weight of relief, gratitude, and awe she had felt throughout the night. The warrior nodded, a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, a recognition of her ordeal, an acknowledgment of her courage, and a promise that she would not face danger alone again. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the morning light casting long, dramatic shadows across the canyon floor. Emma's mind raced, reflecting on the terror of the night, the relentless pursuit, the invasion of her space, the hopelessness that had pressed against her soul. And yet, in the same breath, she felt a deep, almost primal respect for the warrior, who had appeared out of nowhere, who had stepped into the darkness and become her shield. She realized that survival was not just about fleeing or hiding. It was about trust, courage, and the unexpected strength that could arrive when least anticipated. The wind carried the faint cries of distant wolves, the rustle of sage, and the soft hum of the canyon waking to a new day. Emma allowed herself to exhale fully, pressing a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid rhythm of her heartbeat slow. The night's terror was behind her, replaced by the golden warmth of sunrise and the unwavering protection of the warrior beside her. "You will not face this world alone," he said, his eyes meeting hers once more, unwavering and fierce. Emma nodded, the weight of his words settling into her bones. She had endured the night, survived the relentless fear, and now she had a protector, a guardian whose presence would shield her from the shadows that had sought to claim her. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma allowed herself to believe in safety, in survival, and in the unexpected sanctuary that had appeared amidst the wilderness of the Old West. With the Apache warrior at her side, she could face the prairie, the canyon, and the endless sky above. The terror of the night had ended, replaced by vigilance, strength, and the promise of protection. And as the morning sun bathed the canyon in golden light, Emma felt the first spark of courage bloom within her, a courage that would carry her forward, far beyond the shadows she had escaped.